Hi, my name is Emily Roque, and today I'm going to be talking about Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory and how it relates to characters and their character development. To do so, I will be referencing the work Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. First things first, what is Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory? Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory is the theory that the mind is divided into three components: the ID, the ego, and the superego, and that interactions and conflicts among these components create personality. What exactly are those three components, and how do they relate to Wuthering Heights characters? It is the impulsive and unconscious part of our psyche, which responds directly and immediately to urges, needs, and desires. A character who would represent the ID is Heathcliff due to his need to seek immediate gratification of an impulse whilst remaining unaffected by logic or morals. For example, the way he wants to marry his sister even though he knows it's morally wrong. The ego is the only part of conscious personality. It's what the person is aware of when they think of themselves and usually what they try to project towards others. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the ID is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego operates by the reality principle, working out realistic ways to satisfy the ID's demands, often compromising or postponing satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. A character who would be considered the ego is Catherine Earnshaw Linton, and this is because Catherine attempts to balance the ID, in this case Heathcliff, and the superego, Edgar Linton. She follows what society would want by marrying Edgar instead of Heathcliff, but still attempts to remain friendly with Heathcliff for his satisfaction. Last but not least, we have the superego. The superego is seen as rewards, feelings of pride and satisfaction, and punishments, feelings of shame and guilt. The superego is part of the unconscious, that is the voice of conscious and the source of self-criticism. The superego's function is to control the ID's impulses, especially those which society forbids. It also has the function of persuading the ego into more realistic goals rather than simple, realistic ones, and to strive for perfection. In the case of Wuthering Heights, Edgar Linton would be the superego. This is because he attempts to control the ID's impulses as seen fit by society's standards. In other words, controlling Heathcliff so he doesn't marry his sister, Catherine. He also encourages the ego, Catherine, to turn to more realistic goals by marrying him instead of Heathcliff. This image is a good example of the way these three work together. The ID and the superego rely on the ego to keep them checked and balanced. But what happens if there's an imbalance in these three components? Sigmund Freud believed that when the ego failed to balance the superego and the ID, the mind could develop mental illness. In the case of Wuthering Heights, the ego does fail to balance the superego and the ID, and it eventually leads to her death. Shortly before Catherine dies, though, she goes crazy. It is unknown if it is caused by her guilt from not marrying Heathcliff or the guilt she feels that she's still affectionate to Heathcliff while married to Edgar. But what is known is that the lack of balance drove her. It was also believed that when there was an imbalance among these three groups, there would be attempts to correct this through defense mechanisms. A few examples of these defense mechanisms are displacement, projection, rationalization, reaction formation, regression, repression, and sublimation. So when the ego finds that the idea is pressuring too hard for immediate pleasure, it attempts to correct these problems using these defense mechanisms. For example, when Catherine used projection to project that Heathcliff left her, even though she technically left him first. Can only one character be each component? To answer it simply, no. In Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff isn't the only ID. Linton Heathcliff, his son, could also be considered the ID. He acts on his impulses by attempting to marry and grow close with Catherine's daughter for his own gain. He also uses defense mechanisms if he's not getting his way, for example, projection. But Catherine's daughter, Kathy, who could also be considered the ego, will keep him in check by doing the exact same. This leads to Linton becoming more of a manipulative character as you get to know him, instead of the kind, sick boy he once was, and Kathy becoming more of a determined and kind character, whilst remaining free-spirited and becoming less gullible. What does all of this have to do with the character's character development? Well, the answer to this question isn't as straightforward as it may seem. The characters falling under the three different components goes to show why they developed the way they did. To explain this, I'm going to go back to our three main character examples for these components: Edgar, Catherine, and Heathcliff. Starting with the ego, Catherine. As the ego, Catherine was forced to create balance, which in turn led her character to becoming a people pleaser. But later, as she was unable to keep the balance, she slowly went mad, and she became chaotic and mentally unwell. Next, we have the ID, Heathcliff. Heathcliff, being the ID, was always going to follow his desires no matter how morally wrong they were. And he did. He followed his desires with no care for whether they were logical or moral, which led to his character developing into someone who always gets what they want, and if he doesn't, he'll find a way to get it, no matter how immoral it was. It caused his character to go from a sweet young boy to a man crazed with gaining his needs and desires. Last but not least, we have the superego, Edgar. The superego's job is to remain moral while also helping control the impulses of the ID and helping the ego strive for perfection. Edgar's character was able to accomplish this due to him always being kind, moral, and well-mannered. As the novel progressed, he remained this way, but was also given the role as sort of Catherine, the ego's, moral advisor. He would guide her to strive for perfection. He also grew less willing to put up with Heathcliff and more willing to control Heathcliff's impulses, going as far as to punch him. Together, these characters developed in a way where they attempt to balance each other out through whatever means necessary. Overall, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory can be used to talk about and explain certain characters' character developments, whether that be characters from Wuthering Heights or some other novel.